In probably the greatest roast in art history, André Lotz said of the Claude Monet permanent exhibition at the Orangerie that the soul of the Ophelia of painting is dragged down ingloriously by a shroud of water lilies. Monet was dead when his last exhibition was ingloriously launched with great disappointment. Water lilies is what the great French painter was leaving behind after a life filled with success. Taking the now deceased Monet's obsession with water lilies and calling it an artistic and comparing it with the popular figure of Ophelia, who committed by drowning, often next to water lilies, is what you'd expect from French people roasting each other. I guess. I really don't like Claude Monet's lilies. I find them incredibly boring, unengaging, and decorative. But I could be wrong. I remember streaming a long time ago and people telling me that they're actually about World War I and that they're much more than simply painted water lilies in a man's backyard. Great Art Explained told me that Monet's lilies were great for the same reason, that they're about the atrocities of World War I, so I told him I'd watch his video on the topic, which I only did recently. Now, was I convinced by Great Art Explained's interpretation? Are the water lilies redeemed? First, let's see what James from Great Art Explained says.
Claude Monet is often criticized for being overexposed, too easy, too obvious, or worse, a chocolate box artist.
A chocolate box artist is what I see Monet as. I see the water lilies specifically as simply an aesthetic interpretation of the garden that obsessed him.
Monet's water lilies have come to be viewed as simply an aesthetic interpretation of the garden that obsessed him. But they are so much more. These works were created as a direct response to the most savage and apocalyptic period of modern history. They were, in fact, conceived as a war memorial to the millions of lives tragically lost in the First World War.
I greatly encourage you to watch James' video on the topic, as even if I disagree with it by the end of this video, stick around to find out if I do, it's still a valuable interpretation, as most interpretations are. Great Art Explained goes on to talk of the 8 curved water lily panels at the Orangerie Museum. He then says that Monet, after taking a 3-year break from painting, returned to it in 1914, where his works would be his very personal response to the mass tragedy of the First World War. On top of that, as James says, Monet's 8 curved panels at the Orangerie could be considered the world's first art installation. With all this information on Monet's water lilies, how could I not admit that I was wrong about them being simply an aesthetic interpretation of the garden that obsessed him? Well, I was skeptical. There's an old man making hundreds of paintings of water lilies for decades, both before and after the war, and I'm supposed to believe that it was made as a tribute to World War I. I needed to be a bit more convinced, so I did my own research and read Mad Enchantment by Ross King, which is in the description of James' video. It's the second book by Ross King I read, and I absolutely loved it. When reading it, I was a little less convinced that these water lilies, more specifically those at the Orangerie, were his very personal response to the mass tragedy of the First World War. I was more convinced that Monet loved his garden and just wanted to paint it. I also love my garden, and that's why I took Géraldine Levin's class, Gardening 101, a guide for growing and caring for plants, to not only grow potatoes, tomatoes, and cucumbers, but also some beautiful flowers. Look how beautiful they are. My plan for the first part of the summer was to grow these flowers, which I was able to do masterfully. And now, for the second part of the summer, I'm going to take Shivani Patel's Floral Exploration with Gouache, learn to paint flowers and create beautiful compositions to learn to paint these flowers. And that's what's great about Skillshare, which are sponsoring this video. It's the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes on drawing, painting, designing, filming, and more, even gardening. And Skillshare can also help you with what artists struggle with the most, which is making money off their art, if that's what you want. There are classes on how to make a YouTube channel, on social media promotion, and on how to sell your art. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So you can try it out, see how much you can learn from it in 1 month for free. Free knowledge. Go check it out, and thank you again, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. All right, so what did I learn from doing my research on Monet's water lilies? First, his project realized at the Orangerie for a massive circular room wasn't conceived of during the war, but about 20 years before. He no doubt explained his old dream to his guests, expressed as early as 1897, to decorate a circular room with paintings. Alright, but that doesn't mean that his dream could have changed during the war. Monet might have wanted to decorate a circular room with paintings before, but made it in homage to the fallen victims of the war later, as he painted. This circular room wasn't the first installation. As Ross King writes, Monet and Clemenceau may have regarded with some envy the event unfolding in the Rue de l'Université in Paris. Here, the huge circular room had been inaugurated, when the Panthéon de la Guerre was unveiled in its purpose-built panorama. The finished creation was 45 feet high, 128 feet across, and 402 feet in circumference. It incorporated 5,000 full-length portraits of French and Allied leaders and soldiers, including the defiant-looking Clemenceau. So, we can imagine that since these water lilies were his very personal response to the mass tragedy of the First World War, Monet painted them while having these victims in mind. In a letter to Raymond Coquelin, he wrote that even though he felt shame for painting during the war, it's true that moping changes nothing. Therefore, I'm pursuing my idea of a grande décoration, a great decoration. He would also write, I'm not creating miracles, and I'm wasting a lot of paint. But this absorbs me enough that I don't think too much about this ghastly, appalling war. This definitely sounds like someone who used painting as an escape from the atrocities of war, rather than someone who used painting as a very personal response to the tragedy of the First World War. Unless that very personal response is to avoid it, to not think about it, and continue to paint in your garden. Ross King writes, as Monet was seemingly almost done his series, even so, in February 1915, it was incredibly audacious, if not blatantly impractical, to envisage staging a solo exhibition of major new paintings, and paintings of a lily pond at that, ones that had been executed, as he told everyone, as a distraction from the anxieties of wartime at a time when, he acknowledged, other Frenchmen were suffering and dying. Later, King writes, Monet worried about several poor soldiers in particular, but when Michel, his son, arrived home on leave in March, having seen some terrible sights, Monet peevishly complained that his son's presence singularly upset my calm and regular way of life. The sun is really getting in my face and I can't read, unless I go like this, but I can't really do that. So I'm just going to go like this. I think Monet didn't really consider war when painting his water lilies. He was quite actively trying to avoid it, as I'm trying to avoid the sun. But death of the author, Monet's intentions don't really matter much, and he did, after all, give his paintings when the French won World War I. To be clear, he wanted to give two, but then Georges Clemenceau, the hero of France when World War I ended, and good friend of Monet, convinced Monet of giving his grande décoration. In 1916, Rodin had his own museum by donating his art to the state, securing his legacy, and old Monet could do the same, which he did. Through my readings and research, the end of World War I seemed more of an opportunity for Monet to publish his grande décoration, have it state-sponsored, and have his own museum. Monet didn't make his series available until 1927, almost a decade after the end of the war, and that's because he died. However, Monet's friend Gustave Geffroy, a historian of Impressionism, did frame the donation of the series as a bouquet of flowers in tribute to the victorious war and triumphant peace, which is far from representing the death and destruction of World War I. King writes, Monet's donation was at last something much more substantial than a vague promise made in the aftermath of the armistice. But King himself doesn't really link the series to the war or the armistice very much. Monet's offering, if we do wish to link it to the war, is one more of nationalism and celebration. Monet was perceived by Clemenceau notably as the prime example of what French art is as compared to the so-called German barbarians. I believe that if this series is war-related at all, it's because it's propaganda for the civilized, triumphant French culture, as opposed to the uncultured Germans. However, my favorite part of this story is its end. The exhibition, the project in general, was a failure. Monet died and Clemenceau was hoping to immortalize his friend at the Orangerie. However, he was greatly disappointed. Clemenceau observed bitterly that a sign announcing a dog show in another part of the building, for the growling canines had returned to the Orangerie, was much more prominent than the sign announcing the inauguration of the Musée Claude Monet. More than a year after the inauguration in June 1928, Clemenceau was disappointed by his visit to the Orangerie. There wasn't a soul there, he lamented. During the day, 46 men and women came, of whom 44 were lovers looking for a solitary spot. In Monet's room at l'Orangerie, water would leak. They'd eventually use the rooms to host other exhibitions hiding the Monet paintings, and they even used the place for storage. The exhibition got reviews, some were good, but some were terrible, calling Monet's paintings merely postcard niceties of a certain American taste, purchased by the vulgar nouveau riche. I like that. Finally, Camille Pissarro's son, Monet's godson, Paul-Émile Pissarro, claimed that Monet had been buried twice, once in 1926 after his death, and a second time in 1927 with the opening of the Orangerie. So, what happened? Monet was a painter who rose to fame in a completely different era from the one he died in. He evolved during La Belle Époque, which King beautifully illustrates as follows. This image of Paris, with its boulevards, gardens, cafes, and women of fashion, was that of Monet and the Impressionists, the happy world of beauty and elegance, of casual everyday leisure that they had brought to life and commemorated under their brushes. Monet's garden, for some, as well as his paintings of his garden, were as much a part of the visual vocabulary of Paris as the Art Nouveau entrances to the metro stations and the dancers at the Folies Bergère. When I think of the beautiful times of peace a novelist turned soldier would write to Monet from the trenches barely 8 months later, I see often the gorgeous garden and the large dining room at Giverny. But the world had changed. The idyllic world represented and symbolized by Monet's paintings were shown to be a facade in the face of the horrors of World War I. How could we even think of focusing on the bourgeois who painted his garden for decades when, now more than ever, through surrealism, expressionism, and Dadaism, to name just a few, so many artists had things to say? Think of the surrealists who explored the subconscious. Think of Duchamp's urinal that challenged people's notion of what art is. Or think of artists such as Kirchner who represented our increasingly alienated world. I don't care for Monet's water lilies because, as he admitted it himself, they are decoration. They're not meant to make you think. They're not meant to challenge you, and arguably, they're not even there to make you feel. They're ambiance, they're decoration, a great decoration. It's beauty for the sake of beauty, color for the sake of color, art for the sake of art. And I think it's normal when seeing such revered paintings to look for something more. The water lilies are so important, they must have a deeper meaning than just looking nice. It's boring to just look nice. There's no meaning in just looking nice. So we desperately look for meaning when sometimes there is none. The meaning of the water lilies is that they look nice, and that's not very meaningful to me, but it could be to you. Maybe you're convinced that the water lilies are about World War I, and again, I encourage you to watch Great Art Explain's video. But I'm not convinced, and I don't believe I was wrong about Monet's water lilies. Alright, it's starting to get dark, so let me know what you think. Am I wrong about the lilies? Are they about war? Is beauty enough to make art meaningful? If you're interested in that last question, I recommend watching my video on art for art's sake. I also recommend leaving a like, subscribing, and sharing the video if you liked it. If you liked what I said, if at least it made you think or it made you engage a little. And I'd like to thank, as always, Roman Brandel, X-Towns, and all my other patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to be in the credits, if you also want to support, check out patreon.com/thecanvas. Thank you.